Over the last 150 years, the nature of fame and how one gains it has changed completely. There have always been women famous for their beauty, but the invention of photography and the early 20th century postcard craze made it easier than ever to gain popularity from your looks. Theatre, for a long time, was seen as far below the likes of opera and ballet as a popular art form. In the 19th century, it became much more respectable in the eyes of society, thanks to the work of people such as Henry Irving, who in 1895 became the first actor to be knighted for his services to the stage. Models, actors and actresses slowly started taking their places alongside authors, composers and painters in terms of respectability and acclaim. Through an ever-increasing number of newspapers, where good journalism took second place in importance to gossip, the lives of Broadway stars and models were printed for the eager masses. There are those who are still remembered by some today, such as model Evelyn Nesbit for her tragic involvement in the so-called crime of the century, French dancer Cleo de Merode for her many scandals, and the likes of Lily Elsie and Maud Adams for their contributions to the stage. But there are some stars who have faded away from the limelight entirely, whatever their success might have been. Maida Sousa was once a well-known beauty and talent, gracing the stages of America, Europe and elsewhere, performing for the uppermost echelons of society, and yet all that remains of her life today are a collection of photographs and old newspaper articles, forgotten by the world. From humble beginnings she rose to fame, and came to a tragic end nearly half a century later. This is her story. Some sources give May's date of birth to be around 1887, but most say she was born May Alvos de Sousa on 6 November 1884 in Chicago, Illinois. The 1887 date is very unlikely to be true, as when her career began following the 1884 date, she would have been 13 or 14, and it is hard to believe she could be any younger. It is likely that as she got older and her career progressed, she might have taken a few years off of her real age, as many actresses did, leading to the confusion. Her father, John de Sousa, was a police detective of Portuguese heritage, and her mother, Bridget Caroline Walsh, known as Carrie, was of Irish descent. In 1891, a brother, Marvin, was born. From an early age, May had a love of music and had been blessed with a beautiful voice. She gained a scholarship to the Chicago Conservatory of Music in the late 1890s, and eventually graduated with honors. She also won a competition that was held at the school, or in some accounts by the Church of the Holy Name Parish in Chicago, to go to Europe and study under the tutelage of the famed singing teacher, Madame Matilda Marchesi. Many of Marchesi's students went on to have illustrious opera careers in both Europe and America, and one, Regina Puccini, became a First Lady of Argentina. There are different accounts of when she studied under Madame Marchesi. Either she went immediately and her career began soon after she returned to Chicago, or she put off going until the opera season was over and went to Paris to study later. Whatever the truth, one day in 1898, Chicago's most eccentric politician and alderman, John Joseph Coghlan, known as Bathhouse John, strode into her classroom and asked her to sing for him. He had written a rather cliché poem called Dear Midnight of Love, which he had had set to music and whipped up a great deal of anticipation about. He was so proud of it, he confidently asked Emma Calvé, the most famous opera singer in France at the time, who had also been a student of Marchesi and who happened to be visiting Chicago, to sing it at a performance he had planned at the Chicago Opera House, finally unveiling his musical masterpiece. Calvé read the lyrics and apparently laughed, thinking a simple rhyming ballad far beneath her, no doubt. Bathhouse John knew May's father, who had proudly spoken about his talented young daughter, and after singing a few lines from her school song, May was chosen to sing Dear Midnight of Love. In the weeks leading up to the performance on 2nd October, the local papers had enjoyed making fun of the song and event as a whole, which served to stir up more excitement about it. The opera house was filled with people not knowing what to expect, and probably going along for a laugh. But to everyone's surprise, May's clear soprano voice was beautiful, especially for her young age, and while the song itself wasn't exactly the success its writer had hoped for, although May did sing it on at least one more stage 3 years later in New York, she had taken the first step to stardom. After garnering praise in the papers, May was offered an engagement by a popular chain of vaudeville theatres known as the Orpheum Circuit, which was a golden opportunity for the young girl, considering they had venues all over America, including San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, and Chicago. In December of 1900, she performed at the San Francisco Orpheum, attracting the attention of not only the papers, but also of a theatre manager, Frank L. Purley, who was in the city with his star Alice Nielsen, a Broadway actress and opera singer who was the biggest box office drawer in the country at the time. He hired May to be Alice's understudy. Alice was renowned for her talent as a soprano singer and had formed her own opera company. She was also 10 years older than May, so for the young girl to be in the position of potentially standing in for such a star meant she must have possessed considerable talent and charm. She was only 16 at the time and still new to the stage. Many girls would languish in the chorus of smaller productions for years before they secured any success, and most never achieved it at all. May acknowledged how fortunate she was to be given these massive opportunities so early on in her career in an interview shortly after she became Alice's understudy. She believed she must have a fairy godmother and that she was indeed a fortunate child. Unbeknownst to May, at the time she was working with Frank L. Purley and Alice Nielsen, there were some insidious dealings going on behind the scenes. Purley was secretly being paid by Thomas H. Williams, Jr., the president of the New California Jockey Club, to sabotage Alice and her company from the inside. Williams and Alice had once been close friends, and he had even helped fund her career, but when she refused his proposal of marriage, a condition of which was giving up her blossoming career, he wanted revenge. Depending on whether Williams paid up or not, Purley would either sing Alice's praises to the press or complain that she was a diva and impossible to work with. Eventually, this whole plot would come out in a court case in 1909 after Alice had parted ways with both of them, although not without a struggle to get out of Purley's numerous contracts. May took on various other roles while working for the Alice Nielsen Opera Company. In 1901, she performed her first hit, Dear Midnight of Love, in New York for 2 weeks, and back in Chicago she was enough of a celebrity to introduce an interesting play that imagined life in 2001, along with a few other projects that season. She also joined the largest touring company in America, the Chaperones, that boasted a cast of 34 speaking roles and a chorus of 60, managed by Frank L. Purley. In 1902, she was offered the chance to continue as Alice Nielsen's understudy when she went to London, but May declined because she was afraid of crossing the sea. This refusal makes me think it was more likely that May waited to go to Paris and study with Madame Marchesi than the story that she travelled at once. In the summer of 1902, May was part of a vaudeville lineup at the Alhambra Theatre in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. May then joined the cast of The Storks, an operatic fantasy that opened to a full house on December 3, 1902, at the Dearborn Theatre in Chicago. It became very popular and had a long run with positive reviews, in which May was usually noted as a highlight of the performance. At the same theatre in 1903, May was in another play, The Tenderfoot, from April to August, after which she abruptly left the production. By this time she was quite well established and known in major cities across America. The following year of 1904 was when her success became secure, however. She replaced the same actress, Bessie Wynn, in 2 successful plays. First, The Wizard of Oz as Sir Dashimoff Daly, then Babes in Toyland as Contrary Mary. In the autumn of 1905, May finally overcame her fear of crossing the seas and arrived in London, where she was soon given the titular role in Cinderella on Drury Lane. It opened in December, and the reviews accorded May with high praise for her beauty, acting talent, and lovely voice. Other musical comedy roles on the London stage soon followed this first success. May played Violet Stanford in Castles in Spain, which began in April 1906 at the Royalty Theatre. She had a part in The Catch of the Season, and then, beginning in June of the same year, she played O Mimosa-san in George Edwards' revival of the popular 1890s musical comedy The Geisha. George Edwards was essentially the inventor of the Edwardian musical comedy genre, and if he wasn't quite its full originator, he had certainly perfected it. Under his management, the Gaiety Theatre had thrived, producing hit after hit and becoming famous for its beautiful Gaiety girls. Edwards gave May a starring role in his production of Aladdin, and then in The Girls of Gothenburg, both at the Gaiety Theatre. On the 28th of June 1906, when May was set to be in The Geisha, her 21-year-old maid and friend Emma Finch was hit by a speeding car and killed on Brompton Road on the way to the performance. May was most likely devastated and shaken, but the show must go on. She had become well known on the London stage at this point, with the papers raving about this new American star, but May herself wanted something more. She was not satisfied with roles, even starring ones, in comic operas and pantomimes, however successful they were. In 1910, she was quoted as saying, "The day has passed when a woman can expect to win real recognition as an actress in the field of musical comedy." The graduated showgirl with her blonde beauty, shapely figure, diamonds and friends with pull has become such a permanent fixture as to hopelessly handicap real merit. I have had some success in the field, but realise that the only permanent recognition for an actress must be won in the legitimate. It was true that many actresses' careers survived on the merit of their looks alone in those days, but while she was celebrated for her beauty, this was certainly not the case with May. While she, like many others, dreamed of being like the great Ellen Terry or Sarah Bernhardt, there was still something to be said for real success in the musical comedy genre. George Edwards would never have favoured May for principal roles in his productions if she had not possessed the talent, charm and comedic timing needed to share the stage with the likes of Lily Elsie and Gabrielle Ray, the Terry and Bernhardt of their own genre. May continued to be a favourite at the Gaiety Theatre as Elsa in The Girls of Gothenburg up until late 1907, and sung in Brighton for the first time that August. She had graced the stages of London for 2 years, become a favourite of George Edwards, and joined the plethora of other American girls to make a hit in English theatre, but many agreed she had outdone all her countrywomen in her success there. And in December of 1907 she made the trip to Paris at last, and this is when she most likely became a student of Marchesi. By March 1908, she was drawing crowds to the Moulin Rouge as one of the first American stars to perform there. In April, it had been reported that May was missing in Paris, after her family had not heard from her in weeks when she usually wrote regularly. A theatre manager, Harry Powers, who owned the Powers Theatre in Chicago, said May had sailed up with him and his wife from Monte Carlo in March, but had no idea of her whereabouts now. The disappearance was forgotten by June when she partnered vaudeville actor Max Dearly in a series of matinees in English at the Théâtre des Capucines. In August, after a brief trip back to America, she returned to London and began preparing to play Consuelo in Havana, a new musical comedy at the Gaiety Theatre, which opened the following month. Still stuck in light opera and comedy roles, we can suppose by this time May was desperate to step into the legitimate, as she called it. In 1910 she gave an interview where she mentioned being offered the opportunity to play Juliet in Romeo and Juliet by a famous French actor she called Monsieur de Max. I can only guess she must be referring to Edouard de Max, an actor who was respected on the Parisian stage and often worked with Sarah Bernhardt. May's French was not good enough at the time, and despite de Max's offer to finance a 6-month stay in France for her to improve and prepare, she declined as she did not want to take that long off from other work. This all happened in 1906 or 1907, before her first trip to Paris. That winter she returned to Europe to perform at the Wintergarten in Berlin. 1908 had been a whirlwind of a year for May, and towards the end of it in November she attended the farewell dinner of the Maharaja of Cooch Behar at the popular Princess Restaurant in London. The Maharaja sat with May to his right, and Ruth St. Denis, a famous dancer who was deeply inspired by the East, to his left. Ruth even wore a sari and veil to the dinner, but May was honoured with the Maharaja's first dance. May ended that busy year in Glasgow, performing the principal female role in a light opera called A Waltz Dream. May spent the first half of 1909 continuing as Consuelo in Havana and in A Waltz Dream, and for the first time turned down other roles. Around this time she promoted brands such as Odal mouthwash, Value soap and Viola costumes, as well as being on the cover of Billboard magazine among others. In the middle of the year, she returned to Chicago, and when asked about her time in England, she made jokes about how formal and apologetic Englishmen were when it came to declaring their love, and said they were screams. In July, May was engaged by the Claw and Erlanger production company to star in a Broadway musical comedy that began rehearsals that October, called The Air King, where her part was written especially for her. Her first appearance on Broadway, however, was in The Goddess of Liberty, which opened that December with May in the prima donna role. It is likely that during that season in New York she met her first husband, Eaton Arthur Haynes, a Wall Street broker from Rochester, New York. He was 31, slightly older than May, who was 26, but said she was 24 on their marriage certificate when they married secretly in April of 1910. She continued to work. She didn't have any other option, as her husband was a complete layabout. When they went to London in 1912, May paid for both of their expenses from her own earnings, and when she filed for divorce 2 years later, she said she had presented her husband with an ultimatum. He either got a job or their marriage ended. Before she got married, a personal tragedy struck May when her mother was found dead in a gas-filled room in the January of 1910. Whether it was an accident or intentional was never established. May had little time to grieve and was kept busy throughout the year, starring in a musical called The Skylark in New York, doing benefit performances, a revival of Gilbert and Sullivan's The Mikado, and finishing the year off by joining the cast of the successful Broadway play The Commuters, and playing the lead in the comic opera The Mayoress. In The Commuters, May was singled out for praise in the reviews, with one saying, "It shows that this pretty young woman who has heretofore appeared in musical comedy only can be a genuine emotional actress if she so desires." That year, May was also pictured with her pet horse, and revealed she had a love of animals and a special connection with this one, whom she often sang to and who could recognise her approaching just by her footsteps. By February of 1911, she was back in London, starring in The Girl in the Train, which ran for well over 300 performances. In the summer, she joined the cast of an operetta called The Count of Luxembourg, in a smaller role, although she was given many chances to shine in duets and even a solo backed by a chorus. It ran for 345 performances at Daly's Theatre alone, followed by a tour around England, and on its opening night King George V and Queen Mary were in attendance, but that was not the first time May had performed for royalty. King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra had attended various plays she had been in during her first years in London, alongside many other members of the nobility. May appears to have left the Count of Luxembourg quite early on, and returned to playing the titular role in The Girl in the Train, and went on a tour around England with it, where it was remarked May had even outdone her predecessor in the role, Phyllis Dare. By this time, May was a skilled professional, much in demand both in America and abroad, and in a position to turn down roles she didn't like. And yet these years where her success was at its height were not her happiest, far from it. In April of 1912, the furnishings to May's New York apartment were sold, and it was reported she was living full-time in Europe. Her husband continued to live a life of leisure off of her salary, and would physically abuse her, making sure to hit her only where the bruises wouldn't show. She was working constantly, playing the lead in a musical called Peggy as soon as The Girl in the Train finished, performing in vaudeville in Scotland, and again playing the lead in another production called Phyllis, all in the same summer. Her husband only stepped up to help her when it came to making sure she continued to work, such as in a disagreement that occurred between George Edwards and May in April 1912, when she was set to appear in The Arms and the Girl at the London Hippodrome. Unsurprisingly, this dispute was stirred up by her husband, and was about her salary, and Edwards wanted to end their contract. He ended up losing his case and having to pay May £250 a week as promised, the equivalent of about £36,000 today. The Arms and the Girl and Phyllis were both hits and ran at the same time, and in the autumn of 1912, May went all the way to South Africa for a series of performances, returning in early 1913 and getting straight back to work as an act in her own right. Her celebrity was established enough that she took over as a comedian and singer at various matinees after the retirement of Fanny Fields, a popular comic entertainer. May frequently numbers among star lineups for concerts during this period, and she appeared in sketch comedy pieces as well. Having her name attached to a performance meant it received media attention and boosted ticket sales, and yet her personal life was crumbling. In August, May was back in New York and declared bankruptcy. She owed over £2,000 and had just £110 in assets, but she still retained her sense of humour, saying to the press that one of her creditors was King George because she had not paid her taxes while in England. In the summer of 1914, she filed for divorce, not for the first time. She had tried in 1912 on the grounds of cruelty and desertion. One has to wonder how much of her debt was due to her husband's leisurely lifestyle, and whether he abandoned her when she could no longer keep it up. She said that her husband had become a very different person after their marriage, and that her next one would have to have some money. She was granted a divorce in late 1914, and it couldn't have been long afterwards that she found husband number 2. Her marriage to Raymond G. Grant, the manager of the United Cigar Stores in Chicago, remains something of a mystery. He is not mentioned on her Wikipedia page, and I can find no reports of their marriage in the papers, except for their divorce proceedings, which began in 1918 and finally ended in 1921, by which time May had already married another man in Australia, Dr. William O'Hara, in 1919. The newspaper coverage of May's second divorce revealed that she had 2 children, one of which was named May Frances, and is reported as being 7 years old in 1921. Only this daughter is mentioned in the later reports, and so it is possible the claim the papers made about 2 children in 1918 is a mistake, but the matter of May Frances's age brings up another question. The report that mentions her confirms she is Raymond Grant's child, and not from May's previous marriage, and it quotes his reasons for divorce, stating that May refused to quit acting and her busy lifestyle and late nights were not good for their daughter. Grant wanted custody of his daughter, and while there are no reports of whether or not he got it, no children are mentioned in May's life from then on, and she had already found a third husband in Australia by 1919, who she possibly married while still undergoing divorce proceedings from her second. One cannot help but wonder what became of little May Frances. She was so young when her parents divorced, and there was such animosity between them by the end if the newspaper reports are anything to go by, with one saying Grant told May he would rather go to jail than support her, that it is possible May Frances did not see her mother again. When exactly May Frances was born and under what circumstances also remain unknown. If she was indeed 7 in the September of 1921, she would have to have been born in 1914, but May was not granted a divorce from her first husband until December of that year, and was working non-stop at the time, leaving little room for a pregnancy which would surely have been reported on if she had appeared on stage pregnant. From late 1914 to early 1915, May starred in a Broadway musical called The Queen of the Movies, whose producer, Thomas W. Riley, had also produced the incredibly popular musical comedy Florodora when it first came to New York from London in 1900. In early 1915, May starred in a revival of the hit play The Arcadians, and then travelled back to England to be in another musical comedy at the Gaiety Theatre, and stayed in the country for 6 months, working throughout. When she returned, she immediately starred in another play, Two is Company, and in 1916 she was part of a vaudeville musical act written and conducted by Leslie Stewart, who had done the music for Florodora. As the 1910s progressed, May's career began to dwindle. This could be because of her marriage, perhaps she turned down more work than her husband realised, or, most likely, she was getting older and could no longer play the fresh-faced starring roles in her 30s. In 1917 there was hardly any mention of her in the papers, and the only articles in 1918 are about her divorce. In 1919 she went to Australia to be in a musical called Goody Two Shoes, where she made a hit as the principal boy. While touring there she met a surgeon, Dr. William O'Hara, and married him, and after this third marriage she retired from the stage. Little is known about her life after this. In England, she got a few mentions in nostalgic articles, reminiscing about the bygone days when the Edwardian musical comedy ruled London's stages. She and her husband moved to Shanghai at some point, presumably having lived in Australia until then. From what is known, they lived a happy life there, where May sometimes performed in the Amateur Dramatics Club, until World War II broke out and everything changed. In 1941, Dr. O'Hara died, and for 7 months May was sent to the Chapay Civilian Assembly Centre, one of many civilian internment camps where the conditions were often harsh. In 1943 she sailed on the MS Gripsholm back to the USA and returned to Chicago, where she had no family left to help her. Her brother Marvin had died in 1921, and her father followed 20 years later in 1941, and what became of the second husband and children is unknown. She worked as a scrubwoman in public schools, where the hard work took a further toll on her health, which was already weakened from her internment. Eventually it became too much for her, and she died on 8th August 1948 from starvation at the age of 66, after she could no longer work to support herself and had ended up in the county hospital as a charity case. She lay unclaimed in the morgue for 3 days, and when she was finally identified, the American Guild of Variety Artists gave her a decent burial. News of her death reached papers across America and even in England, where they remembered her triumphs on the stage nearly half a century ago. Researching May's life has been a fascinating journey. Thank you for watching this video. Please leave a like and subscribe for more like this. Until next time.